This is the third of our sessions on intellectual property, on artificial intelligence and the law here at UC Irvine School of Law in the spring of 2021. This speaker series has been an opportunity for us to explore the impact of artificial intelligence on the law and the impact of the law on artificial intelligence in a number of different areas. So far this semester, we've had a chance to talk about AI in the context of the criminal justice system. We've had a chance to talk about it in the context of the tort system. And today we turn to international law, and in particular to the law of war. We have as our guest today, Professor Rebecca Crootof, who joins us from the University of Richmond. She's been one of the leading commentators on artificial intelligence in the military setting. She is going to present to us her paper today on autonomous weapon systems and the limits of analogy. That paper has been available through our website, and hopefully some of you had a chance to look at it. Well worth reading. So after she presents that work to us for about 20, 25 minutes, then we are also joined by our colleague here at UC Irvine, Professor David Kaye. Professor Kaye is a well-known commentator and scholar and activist in the area of international law. He's the director of the Human Rights Clinic and Program here at UC Irvine. And so we'll hear some comments from him on the topic immediately following Professor Crootof. And then we'll open up for questions. We're in a webinar format today. So the audience, if you have questions, you'll see down at the bottom of your panel, there is a question and answer channel where you can pose questions for Professor Crootof. And I will moderate that conversation after Professor Kaye's comments. We want to wrap up just before the hour. I will also mention at this point that if you are joining us looking for continuing legal education credit, we've been approved for MCLE, and there will be a link in the chat channel that you will see towards the end of the session where you can get the forms and the information that you need to get MCLE credit for this session. So with that brief introduction, I want to turn things over to Professor Crootof.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, so much for the opportunity to chat with you today. I had a chance to look over the list of speakers, and I am just honored to be among so many impressive people. Thanks especially to Dan for organizing this, and to David in advance for what I'm sure are going to be fun and most likely challenging questions. All right, so there is a global conversation right now about how best to regulate autonomous weapon systems. And so I wanted to begin by making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what I'm even talking about here. An autonomous weapon system is a weapon system that is capable of independently selecting and engaging targets, usually based on a combination of pre-programmed constraints and gathered environmental data. They usually run on some form of artificial intelligence. That can be something that's been trained in advance or even has the possibility for in-field learning. I also want to clarify what they are not. So a lot of times when I talk about autonomous weapon systems, people assume I'm talking about drones. Granted, many drones have certain autonomous capabilities, like the ability to autonomously take off or navigate around obstacles. But most of the drones that are in use today are what I would call semi-autonomous, which is they require a human operator either to select or to decide to engage a particular target. Autonomous weapon systems are also not fully automatic systems like landmines or tripwire sentry guns. Landmines, I mean, I guess you could consider them a sort of a dumb autonomous weapon system. There is a geographic and a temporal distance between the deployment of a landmine and the use of lethal force. But landmines are triggered in very predictable ways. We pretty much know how they are going to react when there's no weapons malfunction. In contrast, what's interesting about autonomous weapon systems is even when nothing is actually malfunctioning, because they're gathering and processing complex information using complex algorithms, their actions have a little bit more of an X factor. There's some element, they can be largely predictable, but there is some X factor of something that can't necessarily be anticipated ahead of time. And so as evidenced by the stock market flash crash, Toyota's uncontrolled acceleration problems, and DeepMind's unexpected go moves, it doesn't take a lot of algorithmic complexity for some forms of artificial intelligence to create a situation where a very well-trained deployer or even the original team of programmers can't figure out why a system did what it did or continues to do what it does. Another major difference between landmines and autonomous weapon systems is that autonomous weapon systems can select among different targets. And this creates a really important break in the causal chain between a human decision to use force or authorize the use of force and whether or how that decision is implemented by the weapon system. The last point I want to make about autonomous weapon systems generally is that they are not weapons of the far-flung future, right? This is not a science fiction story. And there's working from home. Let me turn off the phone. All right, so these are not weapon systems that are from the future. There are over 30 states today have weapon systems that are in use or in development with varying levels of autonomy. So for example, the US Aegis control system, that's been used since around the 1980s. It's primarily a defensive system for ships, and it's used to identify and eliminate incoming ballistic missile threats. It can be operated in 4 different modes. One of those modes is the casualty mode, where human operators are assumed to be incapacitated, and the system has the capacity to independently use defensive force against incoming missiles or against airplanes. There's also the South Korean SGRA-1, which is a stationary armed robot that's used to monitor the demilitarized zone. It actually uses Xbox technology. I think it's Samsung, the same thing you might use for like Dance Dance Revolution, to identify the shape of a human being, train a gun on them, and order them to halt or surrender. Now, South Korea maintains that these systems are only used in conjunction with human operators, so used in a semi-autonomous mode, and that the human operator makes any decisions regarding the use of lethal force. But the manufacturer has advertised they have an autonomous mode under which they could fire without any human involvement. Lastly, just as another example, Boeing currently has a $10 million contract with the US Air Force to develop something called the Dominator, a long-endurance unmanned aerial vehicle that could autonomously conduct surveillance and reconnaissance missions and would be armed with these smart submunitions, warheads that can independently search for and engage targets in a 2-acre area after deployment. All right, so hopefully everyone has a sense of what autonomous weapon systems are and are not. They're scary, right? These are fundamentally concerning systems that are being deployed right now. And the idea that these systems are being developed and used without any specific international governance system is deeply concerning to a lot of different folks. And so right now there's a global conversation around regulating autonomous weapon system, and it breaks up into roughly 3 camps. On one side, you have ban advocates who are saying autonomous weapon systems need to be banned entirely. It is inherently wrong, it is inherently dangerous to delegate decisions regarding the use of lethal force to machines. They must be banned entirely. And so there's a bunch of civil society groups like the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots that are advocating for a ban. On the far other end of the spectrum are what I would say the existing law is enough crowd, and they're saying, hey, We have a bunch of tech neutral rules in the law of war that have regulated all sorts of incremental developments in different kinds of technologies. And these will be just fine at regulating the use of autonomous weapon systems as well. All right, so we have tech neutral rules. Well, I'll get into them later, but for anybody who does anything in sort of the tech law realm, you'll be familiar with this concept. It's basically the Easterbrook law of the horse argument, right? Where Easterbrook said, we don't need to regulate cyberspace because we have torts, we have contracts, we have property law, we have a host of rules that'll already be useful for governing this technology. Then somewhere in the middle of these two different camps are people like me who say, well, I say a lot of things, so maybe I shouldn't attribute this to other people. But I say basically that new regulations are needed. My first paper on autonomous weapon systems was called The Killer Robots Are Here. And it was an implicit critique of the ban advocates. I basically conducted a study of all different weapons bans, ranging from crossbows to chemical weapons to permanently blinding laser weapons. I looked at how effective they were, how successful they were, and I disaggregated a bunch of different factors that seemed to weigh for or against a ban likely being successful. And I found that most of these factors were either inconclusive or actually cut against a successful ban on autonomous weapon systems. And I'm actually going to just drop into the group chat an outline of that argument if anybody's interested in that. But the basic idea is that not only are these weapon systems, autonomous weapon systems, in development and use today, they're uniquely effective at certain things, particularly in situations where human beings couldn't survive or would require superhuman reaction time. So for example, they're really great at identifying incoming ballistic threats and knocking them out of the sky before a human might even have known that they were coming. And so there's a host of other factors, but overall I concluded that anyone who's concerned about autonomous weapon systems, like myself, our energies are probably better spent thinking about regulation rather than a ban. Because over and over again, we've seen situations where states are willing to regulate what they're not willing to forego using entirely. And I would be very surprised, I would be very impressed and surprised if states were able to effectively ban the use of autonomous weapon systems. So that was my argument with one side. This paper that I'm going to be talking about today is my argument with the other side. It's an implicit argument with the idea that existing law is already sufficient. Classically, lawyers use analogy to stretch old law to apply to new items, to new actors, to new conduct all the time. It is a time-tested, incredibly useful tool. But the basic idea of this paper is that we're not always going to be able to do that, and we definitely can't do that with regards to autonomous weapon systems. Just that all of the potential analogies that are out there, not only do they not solve all the legal questions, but they might even create some bad regulations. Okay, so let's talk about figuring out the right analogy. Most people tend to imagine autonomous weapon systems either as more independent versions of weapons that are already in use, like more autonomous drones, right, like the Dominator, or as some kind of robotic soldier. And if you're optimistic, you think about Lieutenant Commander Data. If you're more pessimistic, you think about a Skynet-controlled Terminator. And it's not surprising that we grasp at analogies to try and make sense of this new technology. Analogies and pop culture allusions have always helped make new kinds of technologies comprehensible, understandable. And that's why early automobiles were often called horseless carriages. And today we've got a lot of buzz around driverless cars. We use analogies to highlight potential dangers and risks. So the term driverless cars highlights that, hey, you might, if you have one of these, you don't need to attend to the road on a long commute. But it also highlights that there might be no driver, right, to exercise good judgment when it might be needed. We also use analogies to advance regulatory narratives, right, to make regulatory points. Calling an autonomous vehicle a driverless car suggests that in the case of an accident, the accountable actor is somehow missing. If you called it instead a self-driving car, well, that implies that the vehicle itself has some agency, right? Which might operate to deflect attention from maybe the remote designers, manufacturers, or sellers who are making the decisions that actually contributed to the accident happening. And as I mentioned before, from a legal perspective, analogical reasoning is crucial for stretching existing law to cover developing technologies and preventing law-free zones. This is particularly important in warfare and in international law more generally, where it might be a little hard to get states together to make a new law anytime we had new technology. It's better to stretch existing law than to say we have nothing that covers a particular technology. With autonomous weapon systems, just like with any other technology, the choice of the analogy has huge implications. Here, the choice between weapons and soldiers imposes entirely different regulatory regimes under the law of armed conflict. So the law governing weapons prohibits or permits specific weapons designs. There are tech-neutral regulations, right? So it's prohibited to use weapons that have effects that cannot be controlled, like biological weapons, right, that are inherently indiscriminate. It's prohibited to use weapons that cause superfluous injury or suffering, so injury that's excessive to what is needed to accomplish a military objective. Examples of this are poisoned weapons with slow-acting poison. There's no need to have that on a weapon to accomplish the objective of incapacitating a combatant in the moment. There's also a host of what I would say is more tech-specific regulations that regulate the use of particular kinds of weapons technology. So we have prohibitions on the use of chemical weapons with an extensive list of precisely what chemicals are prohibited by that convention. So those are most of the laws governing weapons. The basic idea there is that a weapon could be lawful or unlawful based on these tech-neutral and tech-specific requirements. On the other hand, we have all of the law governing soldiers, which, like anything that's trying to regulate an autonomous entity, tries to regulate what they do, right? Not who they are. And so a lot of these laws regulating the conduct of soldiers assumes the autonomy of the user and tries to constrain that autonomy through inculcating norms on the front end and using the threat of punishment on the back end. So under the law of war, soldiers have to be trained in the law of war. They're required to act in accordance with the laws of war. And anytime they violate the law of war, they have to be held accountable for their war crimes. So to sum up, any given weapon is lawful or unlawful, whereas soldiers can act lawfully or unlawfully. Combatants can act lawfully or unlawfully. And so choosing between these analogies of weapons and soldiers or combatants actually ends up predetermining the answer to some of the tricky legal questions around autonomous weapon system. One of the most fundamental ones is, are they lawful? Like, are autonomous weapon systems okay to use? And one of the most fundamental law of war requirements is the principle of distinction. The idea that in war, when you're targeting, when you're conducting an attack, there's an obligation to distinguish between lawful targets, like other combatants or military objectives, and unlawful targets, like civilians or wounded or surrendering soldiers. Excuse me. Now, autonomous weapon systems can be used in a discriminating manner insofar as, I'm going to mute and cough. I'm so glad in COVID times I'm not actually in a room coughing in front of people. All right. So as I was saying, this fundamental requirement is distinction. And autonomous weapon systems can be used in a discriminating manner insofar as they might only be used in areas where there's no civilians at risk at all. Outer space, the desert, the deep sea, it's possible to use them lawfully. And so if you analogize them to a weapon, they can be lawful. However, at least at present, autonomous weapon systems themselves can't discriminate between, let's say, an active combatant and a wounded or surrendering combatant. And so they can't be expected to act lawfully, which would make them inherently unlawful. So in short, if you analogize them to a weapon, they're lawful. If you analogize them to a combatant, they're not capable of acting lawfully, and so we can't use them. And so it's not surprising that those on either side of the regulatory debate around autonomous weapon systems use the analogy that best serves their regulatory narrative. And this is not illegitimate, right? The battle of analogies is often the part of the battle of figuring out how to best apply law to different kinds of legal uncertainties. And the analogy that might be appropriate in one legal situation or answering one legal question might not be in another. Going back to autonomous vehicles, there are increasingly autonomous trucks that are being used to ship goods between Texas and California. And it's not inappropriate to analogize them to other trucks for the purpose of figuring out whether or not speed limits apply. But maybe they should be analogized to employees when trying to figure out who's liable should they get into an accident. But all analogies risk entrenchment. And so both the weapons analogy and the soldier analogy, while they might be good in answering particular questions, they're going to fail in crucial ways that I think should give us pause. And I think this is particularly evident when we're considering who or what entity should be held responsible when an autonomous weapon system takes an unpredictable action that results in something horrific, something that looks like a war crime, right? Shooting down a passenger jet, raiding a village. Unlike other weapons, right, autonomous weapon systems are capable of independent action. And so if we think of them only as weapons, I think we're going to be too likely to blame operators for these unpredictable actions that might be entirely outside of their control. And I think this is fundamentally unfair. It puts the human in the position of just being the scapegoat or the liability sponge, right? A human that's in the loop only to soak up responsibility without any actual power to minimize the damage, right? Or minimize the risk. So that's the problem, I think, with the weapons analogy there. And then the soldier or combatant analogy really doesn't work because, unless you want to argue, I can't go so far as to argue that autonomous weapon systems themselves should be held criminally liable for violating the law of war, right? If we try to use the combatant analogy, we would say, well, the entity that violated the law of war should be held liable. I think that's one, a little absurd to consider holding the robotic system or algorithm itself liable. But two, it's actually not even going to be possible because a criminal liability requires a requisite mens rea to commit a war crime. And the standard for war crime is to act willfully, which is usually defined as acting either with the intention to commit a war crime or acting recklessly. And autonomous weapon systems simply won't meet either of those standards. They're not going to act with what we think of as human intention or human recklessness. Okay, so then I said, maybe we're just not thinking imaginatively enough about analogies, right? What other entities are capable of autonomous, unpredictable, sometimes very harmful actions that we cannot hold criminally liable? And as a parent and as a cat owner, the answers are obvious. Children and pets, right? Children and animals. But while I think these are actually far better analogies for autonomous weapon systems than either weapons or combatants, the law behind both of these isn't helpful. Remember, the whole point of this analogical project right now is trying to figure out, do we have a legal regime that's going to address this problem of accountability? Now, child soldiers are banned to protect children from the horrors of war. So this is an issue where the underlying justification for the law doesn't match. I don't think even the most enthusiastic ban advocate would say that they're arguing for a ban on autonomous weapon systems to protect autonomous weapon systems, right? So the underlying justification there doesn't work. So turning to animal combatants, there's a long history of animal warfighters, including dolphins, ravens, horses, elephants, dogs, and yes, even cats that have served with distinction. The problem here with animal combatants is that there's no law. The single international legal reference to animal warfighters is in Protocol 2 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, where it states that it is prohibited to hide booby traps on animals or in animal carcasses. And so while we have a great analogy in terms of the issues that I'm particularly concerned of, we have no law with animal combatants. And so here we end up actually with a panoply of examples of the potential pitfalls of using analogies to stretch extant law to apply to new technologies. We've got an analogy that falsely underemphasizes a trait, right? The weapons analogy underemphasizes the capacity for autonomous action. We've got an analogy that falsely overemphasizes a trait, right? Using the combatant analogy would overemphasize autonomous weapon systems' capacity for intentional decision making. We've got an analogy where the underlying justifications for the associated law don't transfer, right? The child soldier one. And then we've got an analogy that just simply isn't legally useful because there's no law, the animal combatants. The goal here is to have some sort of law regarding autonomous weapon systems. And so just saying we should analogize them to animal combatants creates more of a law-free zone than not using an analogy in the first place. Then on top of the misleading problem, there's another issue. All analogies are false in some way, and all of these limit our understanding of what might constitute an autonomous weapon system. And if we limit our understanding of the system, we limit our ability to regulate it well. So first of all, autonomous weapon systems are built on code. And if we overlook that, we overlook how they can be hacked and spoofed and tricked and remotely controlled in ways that aren't true for any of these carbon-based life forms, right? And so you might be familiar with this famous example of how adding a few pixels to a stop sign can convince an autonomous vehicle that a stop sign is actually a speed limit sign. I'm dropping a picture into the chat again. Militaries are extremely concerned about these same sorts of adversarial attacks on autonomous weapon systems, but none of these analogies I've discussed highlight this potential risk. Second, all of these analogies implicitly imply, right, that, I guess that's a repetitive, but they definitely implicitly imply that autonomous weapon systems will be a single embodied unit. But they might take a variety of forms. I think they're most autonomous weapons are likely to be disembodied malware, right? That they won't have a physical manifestation, even though they may very well have physical effects. Autonomous weapon systems might also consist of a network system of different sensors and robots that are linked together, but don't operate as like one single physical entity. And these different forms and capabilities will affect how autonomous weapon systems can or should be regulated. Okay, so just to wrap up, major argument here is that, well, today, yeah, it's fair to say most autonomous weapon systems in use today can be analogized to weapons. They're sufficiently predictable in how they act for that analogy to hold in most cases. But I don't think it's going to be long before that analogy breaks down, and it may very well have already in the case of responsibility for accidents. Ultimately, I think the lack of an appropriate analogy for the accountability question highlights the impossibility of trying to group all different kinds of autonomous weapon systems together under one heading or regulating them all with the few extant tech neutral rules that we have. Autonomous munitions are different from autonomous weapons platforms, are going to be different from autonomous operational systems, and they're each going to have fundamentally different capabilities and raise different legal questions. And I think for each one, we're going to need to critically evaluate the appropriate analogy for each legal question raised by each legal manifestation, Sometimes using analogies will allow our extant tech neutral rules to be sufficient and provide guidance. Sometimes there's going to be no analogy that works for answering a particular legal question. And in those cases, it's time to start talking about developing new rules. I think the sooner we can acknowledge the insufficiency of these existing analogies, the sooner we can begin that work of focusing on what rules are going to be best to regulate this new kind of technology. All right, thank you all so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Fascinating and very troubling. Professor Kaye, comment for us, please.
Sure. Dan, thanks for inviting me. Rebecca, the paper's great, and I really want to encourage everybody, all the participants, if you haven't read the paper, I would really encourage you to read it, in part because I think what Professor Crootof does is really introduce some distinctions and definitions around autonomous weapon systems that are going to inform the regulatory discussion moving forward. And you do it really well, Rebecca. I really like, there's a few things I just want to mention that I really like before I get into some questions that sort of take us to the sort of where you leave off in the piece, really. I love that you call them systems. You know, I think that it's important for people to recognize that the kind of weapons, I mean, all weapons these days are basically systems, but I think what you're embedding in your phrase autonomous weapon systems is the complexity of these kinds of weapons. And they're complex in ways that I think are new and which I'll get to in a minute. But one of them is one of the things you just mentioned, which is your description of data and code. You know, a lot of our discussion around algorithmic accountability and AI accountability has focused not just on, you know, the software that makes these systems run, but the data that informs it. And I think one of the questions that might inform a discussion in the law of war in this space, sort of a discussion that the law of war hasn't really engaged in so well in the past because it really hasn't had to, is the nature of information input, which is really different from focusing on either the combatant or the weapon itself. So anyway, I think it's really great. I love the sort of the way you kind of take apart each analogy and end up with this statement toward the end, which is, we should acknowledge the fundamentally distinct nature of these new warfighters and create appropriate supplemental law, which is where I want to push you ultimately. So my first question is, should we be relying on, at least in our discussion of regulation, should we be relying on where those systems are right now, where those systems are in terms of development over the next few years, or should we be taking a broader approach and thinking about the kind of dangers? And I agree, they start to sound a little science fiction-y, but they're not that far off. And so I wonder if our discussion around law should be based on the weapons that exist today, or they should be based on the trajectory of weapon development right now. You know, we talk about, you know, generals are always fighting the last war. And it's also true for weapons regulation. Weapons regulation is usually regulating the weapons that we have today are from a past generation. You know, the additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions were developed after Vietnam, you know, for good reason, you know, with a very deep focus on the way war was fought then. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether there's something maybe fundamentally wrong with the way we think about regulation in that sense, and whether we should be, even if it's possible, to be thinking forward. Okay, so I have three more specific questions. So one is,
start writing down. Okay.
Well, and you don't have to answer these all. I think these are questions that that your paper raises, and And maybe these are questions that we all should be grappling with, rather than just saying, you should answer them right here. So one is, you talk about the principle of distinction. So obviously, I mean, Article 48 of the Additional Protocol to the Geneva Conventions, presents this fundamental rule that states parties to conflicts have to distinguish between combatants and civilians. And by the way, in my experience, cats are always a combatant, just to make that part clear. But you address this really nicely in the paper, and I wonder if we could think a little bit more about whether autonomous weapon systems really do satisfy that principle of distinction. And I say this also acknowledging that humans fail the principle of distinction, often not by some intentional, willful criminality, but you kind of passed over this. You mentioned the shooting down of a civilian airliner. I was actually, as I was reading your paper, I was thinking about the 1988 shoot down of Iran Air 655 by the USS Vincennes, which was really purely human error, but it was human error informed by a reading of the technology. And it made me think about whether those kinds of errors, and that one led to almost 300 people being killed on that in that shoot down, whether there are lessons we can learn from that and apply in the autonomous weapons area, because that's really about the principle of distinction, which I think your analogies drill down into really nicely. The second question has to do with the purpose of development of these weapons, and I wonder if there's something different about the purpose here that should give us a kind of different vantage in a way. So the purpose, let me take it from the ban perspective. So I think oftentimes ban advocates will argue, and I'm really simplifying, and this isn't all ban advocates, but they will argue that one of the reasons why autonomous weapons have developed and will continue to develop is to make war safe for one side, make war safe for one belligerent, and deadly for the other side. And that kind of purpose approach is in a way is designed to make war unseen by the weapons, the developing nation. They evolve, the weapons systems evolve in this environment of seeking to impose the most damage on the other side with limited damage on one's own. Now, that's normal for all development of weapons, but I wonder if there's something a little bit different about autonomous weapon systems, in the sense that they seem to be moving towards taking human combatants out of the equation on one side, but not the other. And I wonder if there's something about that kind of newness in warfighting that we should think about as we're thinking about regulation or ban. And then the third question is really just, your work on accountability is really great, and I would encourage people to read your work on accountability in this space also. But I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the accountability side here. So there's a sense that autonomous weapon systems, they get developed. There's almost like an agency-free environment. They're just developed. It's very passive. I don't mean in your writing, but in the overall discourse about these systems. And then they exist, and then there's nobody to hold accountable for either their mistakes or their use in intended ways. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about how you think about that. You end, like, near your conclusion, you say we should be having a larger conversation about the amount of human oversight, control, or judgment necessary in the targeting process for all attacks. And so it seemed like you were setting us up for your next article. And I want to know if you like, what is it that you think is the solution on the accountability side? Because as we get to this stage where these weapon systems are so attenuated from human engagement, even if there's a human in the loop, I mean, the human in the loop may not even fully understand the weapon system that they're responsible for. How do you think through the accountability? And I know that your accountability argument is that it should be a matter of state responsibility as well, which I totally subscribe to. I think that's right. But these weapons are going to exist, and there will be attacks that result in massive death and destruction, and people will demand accountability for those. And I'm wondering how you think those through. So I'll stop there because I imagine there are others who have questions, but I really enjoyed reading the paper, and congratulations to you on it.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for these fantastic questions. Dan, we have 4 hours, right? To answer all of these?
Well,
right?
David said you don't have to answer all of them right now, but maybe you could give a little.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. I will tackle them and and still let people out on time.
And maybe I could say, Rebecca, I mean, I raised these aren't necessarily questions, certainly not that you have to answer now. I think that the real benefit and the great thing about your paper, its quality, is that it triggers these kinds of questions that we all should be asking ourselves. So I don't raise them as like you need to answer all of them right now. I just think that these are the kinds of questions that we should all be grappling with. And I don't know whether there are really good answers for any of them right now. So you could sort of pick and choose what you want to answer, how you want to respond.
I'll tackle a lot of them. I think you basically hit on a lot of different elements of my research agenda. One being on this question of, do we go with a more tech neutral or tech specific kind of regulation? Do we focus on the weapon systems we have right now? Do we try and regulate for the future? And so this is a project and a question that I've picked up in a piece called Structuring Tech Law, where I and my co-author BJ Ard, we sort of tease out the pros and cons of using more tech neutral language, right, which has the benefit of being a little bit more future proof, right, and encompassing more things that you can't necessarily predict ahead of time, but has the negative or the risk of being over inclusive, right, and sometimes counterproductive as new systems develop that are actually better that might be prohibited based on some earlier misconceptions or disproven assumptions. And then you've got tech-specific regulation, which is more clear, right? And so it's easier, you have better compliance because it's more clear about what the rules actually are, but they quickly become outdated, right? They're limited in their application. I think two important things to keep to conceptualize when thinking about the benefits of tech neutral and tech specific regulation is that it's always a spectrum, right? It's never a binary. You can always make any given rule more tech neutral or more tech specific. And I think another thing that often doesn't get enough attention is that where it puts power, where it puts the decision-making power, right? The more tech specific a rule is, the more the power lies with the rule maker, be that the legislature or the treaty negotiator, or the agency rule maker. Whereas the more tech neutral rule is, the more the power lies with the interpreter, right? And so the interpreter might be the agency again, interpreting a rule, or a judge, or an industry, or the regulated entity. And so thinking through those two different axes of like, how far in the future do we want to attempt to regulate is part of the analysis, and who do we want to have the power to actually make the decisions about where the rubber meets the road, and who's going to have the best expertise for that particular question. So I'm sidestepping answering it in this space and throwing out some, I think, important generalizations. I will say my one point on that with regards to autonomous weapon systems is I think the conversation internationally, for political reasons, has been focused on more futuristic technologies than where we are now. And I understand that politically, right? States don't, my whole point of my Killer Robots Are Here article was that states aren't going to be willing to give up some of the capabilities that they have right now. What I fear is that in focusing that conversation in the future, instead of on the capabilities that states have and are using right now, really important rules that we have developed over time are being undermined by the use of autonomous weapon systems in use right now. And so I think, agree with you that a lot of times regulations are backwards looking and a little too much. I think we actually have the opposite problem right now with autonomous weapon systems, is that the political incentives are to look towards the future instead of focusing on regulating the systems that are being used right now. And I think, and I'm over here shouting, pay more attention to those. There are problems that we have right now. In terms of the distinction point, this actually goes also to your question about accountability. You're right, of course, right? That humans make mistakes all the time, right? That humans misidentify unlawful targets as lawful targets, right? They think that a civilian is actually a combatant. And a lot of times that's not due to intentional action, that's not due to reckless action, that's due to error. It's due to a host of different errors. It's due to individual errors, right? The biases of the moment. It's often due to data errors, right? So actually just having incorrect data on a target or outdated data on a target. And it's sometimes due to communication errors where there's more known about a target than is actually conveyed to the commander making the decision. This was the issue with a US airstrike in Syria about 2 years ago, where the intelligence team knew that a certain building was a mosque, but they didn't convey that to the targeting team, right? And so the mosque was targeted, thought to be a legitimate military target, and it wasn't. And so it didn't actually violate the distinction principle because it was just all errors. It was just all errors all the way down. And the distinction principle basically says it has to be, the violation is in some intentional action, right? Some intentional or reckless action, or arguably a failure to take feasible precautions. It's debatable in that case whether or not that happened. And this gets at a greater accountability question, I think. It's more inherent to the law of armed conflict more generally. I think studying the interaction of law and technology is so much fun, but it goes in all these different directions, right? Sometimes you have a new technology that creates a new problem that you've never seen before, and you've got to figure out, okay, well, what do we do with social media, right? And then sometimes you have new technology that highlights this latent ambiguity that has long been there, right? And that just wasn't, I'm going to use Jack Balkin's term, right? Just wasn't salient enough, just wasn't important enough, didn't happen enough that it was a problem. And I think what autonomous weapon systems that I'm increasingly believing is autonomous weapon systems don't create an accountability gap. They are highlighting this accountability gap that's at the heart of international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, the law of war, that there is no real international accountability for accidents in war. And that we have we have international criminal law for create criminal liability for individuals who commit war crimes. We have this law of state responsibility for when states are responsible for internationally wrongful acts, right, which have to have an element of wrongfulness to them. We've got nothing for for accidents. And so my new project right now is working on a piece I'm calling War Torts. I already have a piece called War Torts, so I've got to think of another name for it. My first piece called War Torts was about the need for strict liability for accidents caused by autonomous weapon systems, very much focused on them. The more I got into it, the more I've kept thinking about it in the past few years, the more I see the same argument about accountability gaps made with regards to a bunch of different military technologies. And it's always this issue of no accountability for accidents. And so I think a host of military technology, cyber operations, drones, autonomous weapon systems, AI decision assistance are highlighting this other gap. But that's, like I said, 4-hour conversation. In terms of the purpose of the development, yes, as you said, from crossbows to cannons to bombers, right? There's always been a goal in weapons development to minimize risk to your own troops while affecting the same amount or more damage on the enemy. And that has always been constrained by the prohibitions on causing disproportionate harm to civilians, right? That's been sort of the boundary on why we just don't lob things indiscriminately anymore. And so I think autonomous weapon systems are a progression in that theme. There's always a question of, is this a difference in degree that is a difference in kind? I think there are arguments that cut both ways on that, but in general, we've seen a progression of weapons development that, more and more makes it easier to go to war, right? Makes it easier to engage in conflict because your troops aren't as risk, and as politicians, you don't have to be responsible for flag draped coffins coming home, right? And so there's an interesting intersection with how this, how the roboticization of warfare, while minimizing harms to our troops, might actually result in more war, right? Might actually result in more death and destruction, particularly if we risk more accidents that harm more civilians. This is all obviously a very American mindset and statements, and I'm very aware of that. The calculus is definitely different for different countries.
Okay. So we have a few questions from the audience. We can grab a couple of those in our last few minutes here. The first one, are you saying that Dr. Strangelove could really happen? That was posted at about the time that you were talking, I think, about the Aegis system and the casualty mode, which is a type of, I guess, fail-safe sort of system. Are fail-safe systems particularly problematic in this type of analysis?
So people are exploring fail-safe systems. I'm not worried about, right, the machine that decides to go to war. I'm not as familiar with Dr. Strangelove to really comment particularly on that. I do love the war games one, right, that decides the best solution to war is not to play. But I think with regards to the Aegis system, actually, so David, you mentioned the Vincennes incident, right, the shooting down of the Iranian jet. They were using an Aegis system, and they were being, right, so in that they were making decisions based on faulty data provided to them by the Aegis system. And I think a lot of times people think a human decision maker in the loop is going to solve this problem, right? Is going to address this risk. If only we have a fail-safe of a human in the loop. And I think the Vincennes incident highlights how that won't always work, right? Because the humans in the loop, in that case, the Aegis system was being used in a semi-autonomous mode. They had data that if they had looked critically at it, would have highlighted that this was not a fighter jet, right? Like that this was a passenger jet, but they overtrusted the system. And oftentimes you have humans in the loop, they're subject to particular kinds of decision-making biases that are unique to hybrid human machine systems. And one of them is this automation bias, this tendency to overtrust a system. Particularly automated or autonomous systems, not just instruments in general. There was a study with flight simulators where pilots trusted computer decisions that they were told were not 100% accurate, more than dials and controls that they were told were 100% accurate, right? And so I think this highlights having a human in the loop is not going to necessarily be a protection or a fail-safe.
Yeah, I guess the counterexample is the Russian officer who did not trust the data that he was being given and actually avoided the Dr. Strangelove scenario back in the 1980s. Second question, so you mentioned we don't have law about animal combatants, but we do have tort law, which you love, and law that one of my former colleagues used to call the law of the moo cow, right? Dealing with animal harms and animal I guess breaches in sort of civilian areas. Can you import any of that to assist in deciding about autonomous weapon systems?
These questions were not fed. I just want to, but Yes, this is one of my arguments, right? Is that in domestic law, we often have strict liability regimes for the keeping of wild animals, right? For the keeping of animals that are maybe valuable in certain ways, might serve some purposes, but are inherently they have an element of unpredictability to them. And sometimes no matter what reasonable care is taken, they can cause harms. And in those situations, the entity that decided to keep the wild animal should be liable and should be held strictly liable. And it's not enough to say, hey, look, I did what was reasonable. They are held liable for the consequences of keeping that animal. And I very much use that argument to argue that states should be held strictly liable for decisions to use autonomous weapon systems on the battlefield. I think they're valuable, right? There are things they can do that no other weapon system can do, but I want to constrain their use. And mostly I'm very interested in creating a compensation regime for victims.
Okay. And then there's a final, more of a comment pointing out 2020 report from ICRC and CIPRI about limits of autonomy in weapon systems that kind of parallels some of your work, and that I imagine you've had a look at.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to time. I have lots of questions, but I will pose them outside of the hour. We want to thank Professor Crootof for being here with us and presenting this, and also Professor Kaye for his commentary. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. We hope that you'll join us again in 2 weeks when we'll be presenting another in the series. Dealing with AI in the employment law context. And so I hope to see all of you there.
Thank you again.